Daniel Tushka rode home 3 days early from selling cattle in Fort Worth, only to find his twin daughters chained to iron stakes in the blazing Oklahoma sun, their water buckets just out of reach while their stepmother sat in the shade sipping sweet tea. What he would uncover about the woman he'd married to give his girls a mother would test everything he believed about justice, family, and the price of trusting the wrong person with the lives of those you love most. The August heat shimmered off the red dirt like a living thing, and Daniel's horse Akash picked his way carefully down the familiar trail toward the ranch house. 3 days of hard riding from Fort Worth had left both man and animal bone-tired, but Daniel felt that familiar lift in his chest that always came with coming home. The cattle sale had gone better than expected, and he had enough money now to fix the barn roof before winter and maybe even buy Kinta and Marley those books they'd been wanting from the catalogue. But something was wrong with the picture spread. Out below him, the ranch looked too quiet for mid-afternoon on a Tuesday. No smoke from the kitchen chimney, no wash hanging on the line, no sign of the girls playing in their usual spots around the yard. Even stranger, he could see his stepmother-in-law Victoria sitting in her rocking chair on the front porch, fanning herself with what looked like a church fan, but she was facing away from the house toward the back pasture. Daniel urged Akash down the slope faster, that familiar knot forming in his stomach that every father knows. The knot that says something is happening to your children and you're not there to stop it. As he got closer, he could make out Victoria's voice drifting across the yard, and she was talking to someone, though he couldn't see who. "You girls, just think about what you've done while you're out there." Victoria's voice carried clearly in the still air. "Your daddy spoiled you rotten, but I'm fixing to teach you some proper respect. Maybe next time you'll think twice before talking back to your elders." Daniel's blood turned cold. He spurred Akash around the side of the house toward the back pasture, and what he saw there made him forget every lesson his grandmother had ever taught him about controlling his temper. Kinta and Marley, his 8-year-old twins, were chained by their wrists to iron stakes driven deep into the ground, about 10 feet apart. The chains were just long enough to let them sit, but not long enough to reach the water buckets that had been placed exactly 3 feet beyond their grasp. Both girls were dressed in their lightest summer dresses, but even so, their faces were flushed red with heat and their lips were already starting to crack. Kinta saw him first. She tried to call out, but her voice came as barely more than a croak. Marley lifted her head and tried to smile, but Daniel could see the effort it took. Neither girl cried, though tears would have been a blessing in that heat. They just looked at him with the quiet endurance that children learn when the adults in their world have failed them completely. Daniel was off his horse and running before he'd fully processed what he was seeing. He dropped to his knees beside Kinta first, his fingers fumbling with the heavy padlock that secured her shackle. The metal was so hot it burned his fingers, but he barely noticed. "Papa," Kinta whispered, her voice like dry leaves. "She said, you weren't coming back until Saturday. She said we had to learn." "Hush now, little dove," Daniel said, his voice surprisingly steady, despite the rage building in his chest like a prairie fire. He moved to Marley, whose chains were secured with an identical padlock. "How long have you been out here?" "Since yesterday morning," Marley croaked. "After breakfast. She said we were disrespectful at the table." "Yesterday morning." Daniel's hands stilled on the padlock as the full horror sank in. His daughters had been chained in the sun for over 24 hours, through the brutal heat of an Oklahoma August day and the cooling but still dangerous night. The temperature yesterday had reached nearly 100 degrees. Victoria's voice drifted from the front porch, still talking to someone Daniel couldn't see. "They'll be fine out there. Little Indian children are tougher than white children anyway. Their blood runs hotter. Besides, Daniel needs to learn he can't just run off and leave me to handle everything Daniel closed his eyes and forced himself to breathe. In his mind, he could hear his grandmother's voice reminding him that anger without wisdom was just destruction. But he could also hear his father's voice saying that some things were worth destroying. The padlocks were identical, which meant Victoria had planned this punishment. She'd had the chains and stakes ready, waiting for the right excuse to use them. This wasn't some momentary loss of temper. This was calculated cruelty. "Papa, the keys," Marley whispered. "She keeps them on a string around her neck." Of course she did. Victoria would want to maintain control, to make sure the girls couldn't be freed without her permission. Daniel looked toward the house, measuring the distance, calculating how fast he could move. But first, he needed to get water into his daughters. He grabbed the nearest bucket and held it to Kinta's lips, supporting her head as she drank in small, careful sips. Her skin was fever-hot to the touch, and when he looked closely, he could see the beginning of serious sunburn across her nose and cheekbones. He moved to Marley and repeated the process, his hands shaking with the effort of staying gentle when every instinct screamed at him to tear those chains apart with his bare hands. "Listen to me, both of you," he said quietly. "I'm going to get those keys and get you free, but I need you to keep drinking water and stay as calm as you can. This is almost over." Kinta nodded weakly. "Papa, she's been different since you left. Mean different. She said things about Mama, about our blood, about how we needed to be broken like wild horses." Daniel felt something cold settle in his chest, alongside the heat of his anger. Victoria had been living in their house for 6 months now, ever since he'd married her in a moment of loneliness and desperation. The girls had never warmed to her, but they'd been polite, trying to make the best of the situation for his sake. He'd thought the adjustment would take time. "What kinds of things did she say about your Mama?" "She said Mama was a heathen who filled our heads with savage ways," Marley whispered. "She said you only married her because white women wouldn't. Have you? And now you were stuck with half-breed children nobody wanted." The cold in Daniel's chest spread outward like ice on a winter pond. His first wife, Ayana, had been full-blood Choctaw like himself, and she died birthing these precious girls when they were barely 2 years old. For Victoria to use his grief and their heritage as weapons against children, she said other things too, Kinta added, her voice getting stronger as the water took effect. "About the land, about money, about how much the ranch was worth. She had men here while you were gone, looking at the boundaries, measuring things." Daniel's head snapped up. Men looking at his land. The ranch had been in Ayana's family for 3 generations, passed down through her grandmother, who'd managed to keep it during the worst of the government relocations. It was some of the best grazing land in the territory, with year-round water and natural shelter. It was also worth a considerable sum to the right buyer. A new voice drifted from the front porch, male and unfamiliar. "So you're certain Tushka will sell once he sees the situation clearly?" Victoria's laugh was like breaking glass. "Oh, he'll sell all right. Especially after today. A man can only take so much before he breaks, and when he does, he'll be grateful for any way out I offer him." Daniel moved closer to the house, keeping low, straining to hear more. "And the children? The children will learn their place, or they'll learn to stay out of my way," Victoria said flatly. "Half-breed brats need a firm hand anyway. Their father's too soft, too caught up in that noble, savage nonsense. But I know how to handle wild things." The male voice again. "The mineral survey confirmed significant copper deposits in the North Pasture. If we can get him to sell at the price we discussed—" "Leave that to me," Victoria interrupted. "I've been softening him up for months. A few more lessons like today's, and he'll be begging me to find a buyer." Daniel had heard enough. He circled back to his daughters, his mind working rapidly. Victoria wasn't just a cruel stepmother. She was part of some kind of scheme to force him off his land, using his children as leverage. The marriage, the move into his house, the gradual isolation from his neighbors and friends, it had all been calculated. "Girls," he said quietly, "I need you to be very brave for just a little longer. When I go to get those keys, there might be some noise, some arguing. I need you to stay calm and quiet no matter what you hear. Can you do that?" Both girls nodded. They were Ayana's daughters as much as his, and she'd taught them strength before the fever took her. They would endure. Daniel stood and walked toward the front porch, his footsteps deliberately heavy on the wooden planks. He wanted Victoria to know he was coming. The conversation on the porch stopped abruptly. When Daniel rounded the corner, he saw Victoria sitting in her rocking chair with a heavy-set white man in a city suit. The man had the soft hands and pale complexion of someone who spent his time in offices rather than outdoors, and his eyes held the calculating look Daniel had learned to recognize in Indian agents and land speculators. "Daniel," Victoria said, her voice taking on that sweet tone she used when she wanted something. "You're home early, dear. How did the cattle sale go?" Daniel didn't answer. He looked at the stranger, then back at Victoria. "Where are the keys?" Victoria's expression shifted slightly, becoming more wary. "Keys to what, dear?" "The keys to the chains you put on my daughters," Daniel said, his voice level and quiet. "The keys you've got hanging around your neck." The stranger stood up quickly. "Perhaps I should be going—" "Perhaps you should," Daniel agreed, never taking his eyes off Victoria. "And perhaps you should stay gone." Victoria's mask slipped completely. The sweet smile disappeared, replaced by something ugly and calculating. "Now you listen to me, Daniel Tushka. Those girls needed discipline, and you weren't here to provide it. I'm your wife, and this is my house now, and I'll run it as I see fit. This is not your house," Daniel said quietly. "This land has been in my family for 3 generations. You've been here 6 months. Long enough to know that you can't handle those wild girls by yourself," Victoria snapped. "Long enough to know that you need help making proper decisions about your future." She gestured to the stranger, who was edging toward his buggy. "Mr. Garrett here has a very generous offer for your property. Enough money to start fresh somewhere else, maybe somewhere more suitable for raising half-Indian children." The racial slur hung in the air like smoke. Daniel felt that familiar tightness in his jaw, the same feeling he'd gotten as a boy when white children called him names. But he wasn't a boy anymore, and these weren't just words. This was about his daughters. "My children are chained in the sun," he said, his voice still quiet but carrying an edge now. "They've been there for over 24 hours, in this heat, without adequate water." Victoria shrugged. "Children need to learn consequences. Give me the keys." "Or what?" Daniel stepped closer. Victoria had miscalculated badly if she thought he would negotiate about his daughter's welfare. "Give me the keys, or I'll take them." Something in his voice must have warned her. Victoria's hand went to her throat, where a small key ring hung on a braided cord. But instead of removing it, she clutched it tighter. "Those girls need to learn respect," she said, her voice rising. "They need to learn their place in this house and in this world. Their mother filled their heads with savage ideas about being proud of their blood, about having rights and dignity. Someone needs to teach them the truth." Daniel's vision went red around the edges. For Victoria to invoke Ayana's memory while defending her cruelty to their children was beyond forgiveness. He moved faster than Victoria could react, his hand closing around the cord at her throat. She gasped and clawed at his wrist, but Daniel was strong from years of ranch work and desperate with a father's fury. The cord snapped, and the keys came free. "You can't!" Victoria gasped. "I'm your wife. I have rights." "You have no rights over my children," Daniel said, already moving toward the back of the house. "Pack your things. Be gone before I get the girls inside." Behind him, he could hear Victoria's voice rising to a shriek, calling after the retreating Mr. Garrett, demanding he do something. But Daniel's attention was already on his daughters. The padlocks opened easily with the small brass keys. Daniel lifted each girl in turn, carrying them into the blessed coolness of the house. He set them down gently in the kitchen and began the careful process of checking them for serious injury. Both were badly sunburned, dehydrated, and exhausted, but alert and responsive. "Papa," Kinta said, as he bathed her face with cool water. "She said she was going to teach us every day until we learned to mind. She said we were too proud, too wild. She said the ranch was too good for people like us," Marley added. "She said we didn't deserve to live here." Daniel's hands stilled. People like us. Victoria had shown her true feelings clearly enough. To her, they weren't a family to be joined, but obstacles to be removed. "Girls, I need you to tell me everything," he said gently. "Everything she said, everything she did, everyone who came to visit while I was gone. Can you do that, for the next hour?" As Daniel tended to their burns and got fluids into them, Kinta and Marley told him a story that made his blood run colder with each detail. Victoria had spent the 6 months since their marriage systematically isolating them from their Choctaw neighbors, spreading lies about Daniel's financial situation and entertaining a steady stream of visitors interested in the ranch's potential value. Men had come to survey the mineral rights. Others had discussed water rights and grazing leases. A lawyer had visited twice, asking questions about Daniel's will and the girls' legal status as his heirs. Victoria had encouraged all of it, presenting herself as a concerned wife worried about her husband's business judgment. "She told Mr. Garrett that you were getting old and couldn't make good decisions anymore," Marley reported. "She said the ranch was too much for you to handle alone. She said if something happened to you, she would be our guardian," Kinta added. "She said she would know how to handle us better than any Indian foster family would." Daniel felt the pieces clicking together like the tumblers in a lock. Victoria hadn't married him for love or even for security. She'd married him to get control of valuable land and to position herself as the guardian of his daughters if something happened to him. The cruelty wasn't just meanness, it was a calculated campaign to break the girls' spirits and make them easier to control. A sound from the front porch interrupted his thoughts. Voices, multiple people, the creak of wagon wheels. Daniel looked out the kitchen window and felt his stomach drop. Victoria was still there, but now she wasn't alone. 3 men stood with her, and one of them wore a badge. The sheriff, Daniel realized, though he couldn't make out which one from this distance. Victoria was talking rapidly, gesturing toward the house, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "He attacked me," she was saying. "Grabbed me by the throat, threatened to kill me. I barely got away. And those poor children, he's been abusing them for months, keeping them chained up like animals." Daniel's blood turned to ice. Victoria was spinning the story, making herself the victim and him the abuser. And she had witnesses now, official witnesses who would take her word over his. A knock came at the front door, hard and official. "Daniel Tushka," a voice called. "This is Sheriff Morrison. I need to speak with you." Daniel looked at his daughters, still pale and weak from their ordeal. The evidence of Victoria's cruelty was written on their sunburned faces. But would anyone believe his word against that of a white woman claiming to be a concerned stepmother? "Papa," Kinta whispered. "What do we do?" Daniel touched her face, gently, then stood to face whatever came next. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Outside, Victoria's voice continued its litany of lies, each one more calculated than the last. But Daniel had something she didn't expect. He had the truth, and he had his daughters' voices to tell it. The question was whether anyone would listen. Daniel opened the front door with deliberate calm, his daughters safely positioned. Behind him in the kitchen, where their condition would be immediately visible to any fair observer. Sheriff Morrison stood on the porch, flanked by two deputies, his weathered face showing the kind of careful neutrality that came from years of mediating disputes in a territory where tensions ran high between different communities. "Sheriff," Daniel said with a respectful nod, "I understand my wife has made some serious accusations." Morrison's eyes flicked past Daniel toward the kitchen, where Kinta and Marley sat at the table drinking water from tin cups. Even from the doorway, the angry red of their sunburns was clearly visible against their dark hair. "She claims you've been abusing those children," Morrison said carefully. "Chaining them up, denying them food and water, says she tried to intervene, and you threatened her life." Behind Morrison, Victoria pressed a handkerchief to her eyes in a performance of wounded innocence. "I was only trying to protect them. Sheriff, he's been getting worse since the cattle sale, drinking more, staying away longer. Those poor babies have been so frightened." Daniel felt the familiar burn of injustice in his throat, but he forced his voice to remain steady. "Sheriff, I invite you to examine my daughters and ask them directly about their condition. You'll find rope burns on their wrists from the chains, severe sunburn from being left in the heat for over 24 hours, and signs of dehydration." "Lies," Victoria interjected shrilly. "He's coaching them, Sheriff. He's told them what to say. Those marks could be from anything." Morrison held up a hand for silence, his attention focused entirely on Daniel. "Mr. Tushka, these are serious allegations from both sides. I'm going to need to examine the children and hear their account directly. You understand I have to follow procedure?" Daniel stepped aside, gesturing Morrison into the kitchen. "Of course, Sheriff. My daughters will tell you exactly what happened." As Morrison entered the kitchen, Daniel caught sight of Victoria's expression through the doorway. For just a moment, her mask of concerned stepmother slipped, replaced by something cold and calculating. She was already planning her next move, already spinning new lies to cover the ones that were about to be exposed. Sheriff Morrison knelt beside the kitchen table, bringing himself to eye level with the twins. His voice gentled considerably as he addressed them directly. "Girls, I'm Sheriff Morrison. I need to ask you some questions about what's been happening here. Can you tell me about those marks on your wrists?" Kinta looked at her father, who nodded encouragingly, then back at the sheriff. "Ma'am Victoria chained us to stakes in the back pasture yesterday morning after breakfast. She said we were disrespectful and needed to learn our place. She put the chains on tight so we couldn't slip out," Marley added, extending her wrists to show the clear rope burns circling them. "And she put the water buckets where we could see them but couldn't reach them. She said that was part of the lesson." Morrison's expression darkened as he examined the girls' injuries. The evidence was undeniable. Rope burns consistent with restraints, severe sunburn indicating prolonged exposure, cracked lips and hollow eyes showing dehydration. Victoria's voice rose from the doorway. "Sheriff, you can't believe them. Children will say anything to protect their father, especially when he's threatened them. Look at how thin they are, how scared they look. That's from months of abuse." Morrison stood slowly, his hand resting on his gun belt in a gesture that wasn't quite threatening but wasn't entirely casual either. "Mrs. Tushka, I've seen a lot of abused children in my time. These girls show signs of recent trauma, not ongoing mistreatment, and their account matches the physical evidence." "Physical evidence can be manufactured," Victoria said desperately. "Daniel could have put those chains on them this morning when he got home, just to make me look bad. He's been planning this ever since I started asking questions about his financial management." Daniel's head snapped toward her. Financial management, another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. "What kind of questions about financial management?" Morrison asked, his lawman's instincts clearly engaged. Victoria realized she'd revealed too much. Well, I mean, as his wife, I have a right to understand our family's resources. The ranch, the mineral rights, the inheritance issues, if something should happen to Daniel. Mineral rights, Daniel interrupted. Sheriff, I've never discussed mineral rights with my wife. I wasn't even aware there were significant mineral deposits on this land. Morrison's eyes sharpened. But someone else was aware, weren't they, Mrs. Tushka? Someone who might have reason to want control of this property. Before Victoria could answer, one of the deputies spoke up from the front porch. Sheriff, you might want to see this. Morrison stepped outside, followed by Daniel. The deputy had been examining the area around the chaining stakes, and he held up several items that made Daniel's stomach clench. Found these buried shallow behind the tool shed, the deputy said. Legal documents, property surveys, and what looks like a forged will. Morrison examined the papers, his expression growing grimmer with each page. This purported will leaves the entire ranch to Victoria Tushka in the event of Daniel's death, with provisions for her to serve as guardian of the minor children. Problem is, it's dated 6 months ago and witnessed by 2 men I happen to know left the territory 8 months ago. Daniel stared at the forged will, understanding flooding through him like cold water. Victoria hadn't just been planning to steal his land through manipulation and legal maneuvering. She'd been planning for his death. There's more, the deputy continued. Found correspondence with mining companies, geological surveys and contracts for the sale of mineral rights, all signed by Victoria Tushka as legal representative of the Daniel Tushka estate. Victoria's carefully constructed story was collapsing around her, but instead of admitting defeat, she doubled down. Those documents are fake, she declared. Daniel planted them to frame me because I discovered his plans to sell the ranch without providing for his children's future. Morrison looked at her with the expression of a man who'd heard too many lies to be impressed by another one. Ma'am, I'm placing you under arrest for child endangerment, fraud, and conspiracy to commit theft of property. You can't, Victoria shrieked. I'm a white woman making accusations against an Indian man. Who do you think people will believe? The racial challenge hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. Daniel tensed, knowing that in many parts of the territory, Victoria's calculation would prove correct. But Sheriff Morrison had been elected by all the people of the county, including the substantial Choctaw population. Ma'am, I believe the evidence, Morrison said flatly. And the evidence says you chained 2 little girls in the sun for over 24 hours while planning to steal their inheritance. Color of skin doesn't change those facts. As Morrison's deputy moved to arrest Victoria, she played her final card. Sheriff, you're making a mistake. There are powerful people involved in this development project, people who won't appreciate interference from local law enforcement. Daniel felt ice forming in his veins. Powerful people. This conspiracy reached beyond Victoria and her mysterious visitors. Morrison paused, his hand on Victoria's arm. What kind of powerful people, Mrs. Tushka? Victoria's eyes glittered with desperate cunning. The kind who have connections in the territorial government. The kind who can make problems disappear for county sheriffs who cooperate, or create problems for those who don't. Are you threatening me, ma'am? I'm explaining reality, Victoria said coldly. This ranch sits on one of the largest copper deposits in the territory. The Territorial Mining Commission has already approved development permits. Daniel Tushka can sell willingly and relocate his family with generous compensation, or he can fight and lose everything in legal battles he can't afford to win. Daniel's mind reeled. The Territorial Mining Commission. Government approval, legal battles designed to bankrupt him. This wasn't just fraud. It was a coordinated effort involving multiple levels of authority. Morrison looked troubled. Mrs. Tushka, are you saying this alleged development has official territorial backing? I'm saying there are forces at work here bigger than one county sheriff, Victoria replied. Forces that have already committed significant resources to this project. Forces that won't be deterred by sentimental attachment to Indian family land. The deputy who'd found the document stepped forward. "Sheriff, there's something else you should see." He handed Morrison a leather portfolio that had been buried with the other papers. Inside were detailed geological surveys, engineering reports, and financial projections for a large-scale mining operation. The scope was staggering. Thousands of acres, millions of dollars in projected revenue, and a timeline that had the operation beginning within 6 months. "According to these documents," the deputy said, "this mining project has already received preliminary approval from the Territorial Governor's office. They were just waiting for the land acquisition to be finalized." Daniel stared at the reports, feeling the weight of forces aligning against him. "Sheriff, my family has held this land for 3 generations. We survived the removals, the wars, the droughts. We built something here, and now someone wants to tear it down for copper," Morrison said grimly. "The question is, how far are they willing to go to get it?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria's laugh was bitter and triumphant. "As far as necessary, Sheriff. Daniel, Tushka is one man with 2 children and no political connections. We represent progress, development, jobs for the territory. Who do you think the government will support?" Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents and weighing the implications. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard experience. "Mrs. Tushka, I've seen what powerful people do when they want something badly enough. I've also seen what happens to families who get caught in the middle, but I've never seen a case where chaining children in the sun was part of any legitimate development project." He closed the portfolio with finality. "You're under arrest for child endangerment and conspiracy to commit fraud. Whatever else is going on here, those crimes are clear and undeniable." As the deputy led Victoria away in shackles, she turned back toward Daniel with eyes full of cold fury. "This isn't over, Tushka. You can arrest me, but you can't arrest the Territorial Commission or the mining companies or the investors who've already put money into this project. They'll find another way." Daniel watched his wife of 6 months disappear into the deputy's wagon, her threats echoing in his ears. She was right about one thing. This was far from over. The conspiracy she'd revealed reached into the highest levels of territorial government, and her arrest would only force the other players to change tactics. Sheriff Morrison approached Daniel as the wagon pulled away. "Mr. Tushka, I have to ask, do you have any idea how valuable this land really is?" Daniel looked out over the rolling pastures that had sustained his family for generations. "I know it's worth more than money, Sheriff. My wife is buried here. My daughter's roots go deep in this soil, but I'm starting to understand that's not the kind of value other people recognize. The geological reports suggest copper deposits worth millions of dollars," Morrison said soberly. "That kind of money makes people desperate, makes them willing to do things they'd never consider otherwise, like chain little girls in the sun, like much worse than that," Morrison replied. "Mr. Tushka, I need to be straight with you. Victoria was small fish in this pond. The real players, the ones with territorial connections and mining company backing, they won't be deterred by one arrest. They'll regroup, find new approaches, maybe send people who are more direct in their methods." Daniel felt the chill of understanding. "You're saying my daughters and I are still in danger?" "I'm saying that when this much money is involved, people who stand in the way have a tendency to meet with accidents," Morrison said bluntly. "House fires, riding accidents, mysterious illnesses. The kind of tragedies that clear up property disputes very efficiently." Inside the house, Kinta and Marley sat quietly at the kitchen table, their sunburned faces turned toward the conversation on the porch. They'd heard every word, Daniel realized. His daughters, already forced to grow up too fast by Victoria's cruelty, were now learning about the larger forces arrayed against their family. "Papa," Kinta called softly, "what are we going to do?" Daniel looked at Sheriff Morrison, then at his daughters, then out at the land that was both their heritage and their burden. The question hanging in the air was larger than what to do next. It was whether they would fight for their birthright or flee to survive, and whether, in a territory where money and political connections mattered more than justice, they would be allowed to make that choice for themselves. 3 days after Victoria's arrest, Daniel woke to the sound of horses approaching his ranch at dawn. But these weren't the measured hoofbeats of Sheriff Morrison's patrol. These riders moved with military precision, and when Daniel looked out his bedroom window, he saw 6 men in dark suits dismounting near his front gate, their movements coordinated like a pack of wolves surrounding prey. Daniel quickly dressed and checked on his daughters, who were sleeping peacefully for the first time since the chaining incident. Their sunburns were healing, but the psychological wounds ran deeper. Kinta had started having nightmares about being tied up again, and Marley flinched whenever anyone approached her too quickly. The knock on his front door came exactly at sunrise, sharp and authoritative. Daniel opened it to find a tall man with silver hair and cold blue eyes, flanked by 5 others who looked more like hired muscle than government officials. The leader's suit was expensive, his boots polished to a mirror shine, and his smile carried all the warmth of a January wind. "Mr. Tushka, I'm Theodore Blackwood, Territorial Representative for the Western Development Commission. I believe we need to discuss your property situation." Daniel didn't invite them in. "I wasn't aware I had a property situation that concerned the territorial government." Blackwood's smile never wavered. "Oh, but you do, Mr. Tushka. You see, your recent domestic troubles have created complications for a very important development project. The arrest of your wife has attracted unwanted attention to what should have been a straightforward business arrangement. My wife tried to murder my children," Daniel said flatly. "That's not a domestic trouble, that's a crime." "Mrs. Tushka's methods may have been excessive," Blackwood conceded with the casual dismissal of a man discussing the weather. "But her goal was sound. This ranch sits on mineral deposits worth millions of dollars to the territory. Keeping that wealth locked up in private hands serves no one's interests." Daniel felt his temper rising, but kept his voice level. "It serves my daughter's interests. This land is their inheritance." One of Blackwood's companions stepped forward, a stocky man with scars on his knuckles and the predatory stillness of someone comfortable with violence. "Mr. Tushka, I think you misunderstand the situation. This isn't a negotiation." Blackwood held up a hand to silence his associate. "Now, Marcus, let's not be hasty. Mr. Tushka is an intelligent man who will surely recognize the practical realities of his position." He pulled a leather document case from his coat and extracted several official-looking papers. "These are condemnation orders, signed by the territorial governor himself. They give the Western Development Commission the authority to acquire your property for fair market value in the interest of territorial economic development." Daniel scanned the documents, his heart sinking as he recognized genuine government seals and signatures. "This says you're valuing the ranch at $800. This property is worth 10 times that amount. The valuation is based on agricultural potential, not speculative mineral deposits," Blackwood said smoothly. "Of course, if you were to cooperate voluntarily, we might find ways to be more generous. Perhaps a position with the mining operation, a house in town for you and your daughters. And if I refuse to cooperate?" Blackwood's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Tushka, let me be direct. Victoria Tushka's arrest has created a public relations problem for this project. The territorial newspapers are starting to ask questions about government involvement in what they're calling the chained children case. We need this situation resolved quietly and quickly." "What happened to Victoria?" Released pending trial, Blackwood said dismissively. Charges reduced to simple assault after key witnesses became unavailable for testimony. She'll likely receive probation and be free to relocate wherever she chooses. Daniel's blood ran cold. Key witnesses, the deputies who had found the forged documents, the evidence of the conspiracy. If they'd been intimidated or bought off, Sheriff Morrison assured me the case was solid, Daniel said. Sheriff Morrison has been reassigned to a position in the territorial capital, one of Blackwood's men interjected. Seems there were questions about his judgment in pursuing charges against a respected member of the community. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. The conspiracy reached even deeper into the territorial government than Daniel had imagined. They could reassign sheriffs, intimidate witnesses, manipulate the legal system itself. Papa. Kinta's voice came from behind him, small and frightened. Daniel turned to see both his daughters standing in the hallway, awakened by the voices. They wore their nightgowns and bare feet, their hair tousled from sleep, looking impossibly young and vulnerable. Blackwood's gaze settled on the twins with calculating interest. Ah, the famous Tushka children. I understand they've been through quite an ordeal recently. Stay away from my daughters, Daniel said, stepping protectively in front of them. Of course, Blackwood said, but his eyes never left the girls. Though I must say, Mr. Tushka, raising children alone in such isolated circumstances can be challenging. Accidents happen so easily on remote ranches, falls from horses, drowning in creeks, snake bites, house fires. The threat was delivered with such casual politeness that it took a moment for the full implications to sink in. Daniel felt rage building in his chest like a wildfire. Are you threatening my children? I'm observing that single fathers face many challenges, Blackwood replied smoothly. Of course, children in more settled circumstances, with proper schools and medical care nearby, tend to be much safer. The town of Cedar Ridge, for instance, has excellent educational facilities. And a very competent doctor is behind Daniel. Mahli whispered something to Kinta in Choctaw. Daniel caught the words for bad men and run away. Blackwood heard them too, and his smile took on a predatory quality. How charming that they still speak the old language. Of course, in proper schools, they'll learn to communicate more effectively in English. It will help them adapt to the changing world. The cultural threat was as clear as the physical one. These men didn't just want Daniel's land. They wanted to erase his daughter's heritage, to turn them into something more acceptable to white society. Girls, go back to your room, Daniel said quietly. Now. As his daughters retreated, Daniel stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind him. Whatever was about to happen, he didn't want them to witness it. Mr. Blackwood, I need to be clear about something, Daniel said, his voice carrying the deadly calm that came before. Violence. My daughters are not negotiating points. This land is not for sale at any price. And if you or anyone working with you comes near my family again, I will respond as any father would. Marcus, the scarred man, chuckled. You threatening us? Indian, you know how many of us there are compared to you. I know how many of you I can take with me, Daniel replied evenly. Blackwood raised a hand for peace, but his eyes showed genuine concern for the first time. He'd clearly expected intimidation to work, not suicidal defiance. Mr. Tushka, let's not escalate this unnecessarily. I'm prepared to make you a final offer. $5,000 for the ranch, plus guaranteed employment with the mining operation, plus education expenses for your daughters at the Territorial Boarding School in Oklahoma City. The boarding school. Daniel knew what that meant. Forced assimilation, cultural erasure, children forbidden to speak their native language or practice their traditions. It was the final insult wrapped in the language of generosity. My daughters will not be going to any boarding school, Daniel said. They'll be staying here on their mother's land, learning their own history and traditions. Their mother's land belongs to the territory now, Blackwood said, dropping all pretense of politeness. One way or another, Mr. Tushka, this property will be developed. You can cooperate and benefit, or you can resist and lose everything, including our lives. Blackwood shrugged. Accidents happen, as I mentioned, especially to people who make themselves obstacles to territorial progress. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders. Daniel looked toward the road and felt a surge of hope. Joseph Battiest, his neighbor and fellow Choctaw rancher, was approaching with 3 other tribal members. They rode slowly but with purpose, their rifles visible in their saddle scabbards. Blackwood followed Daniel's gaze and frowned. "Friends of yours, neighbors," Daniel said. "Word travels fast in our community." As the 4 Choctaw riders approached, Blackwood's men shifted nervously. The odds had suddenly become less favorable, and these weren't intimidated witnesses or isolated families. Joseph Battiest dismounted and approached the porch, his weathered face showing the kind of controlled anger that came from decades of dealing with government officials who spoke of progress while stealing native land. "Daniel," Joseph said with a respectful nod, "we heard you had visitors." "Official visitors," Blackwood interjected, trying to reassert authority. "This is territorial business, not tribal business." Joseph's dark eyes fixed on Blackwood with the intensity of a hawk studying prey. "Any business that threatens Choctaw families on Choctaw land is tribal business. This is no longer Choctaw land," Blackwood said firmly. "The territorial government has exercised eminent domain. Has the tribal council been consulted?" asked Thomas Yahola, one of Joseph's companions. Blackwood's hesitation was answer enough. Under territorial law, the Choctaw Nation retained certain rights over traditional lands, including the right to be consulted on major development projects. "I see," Joseph said quietly. "So, the territorial government is attempting to seize treaty-protected land without proper consultation, using intimidation tactics against a tribal member and his children. Now see here," Blackwood began, but Joseph wasn't finished. "We also heard about the arrest of this man's wife for chaining his young daughters in the sun like animals. We heard about forged documents and conspiracy to commit fraud. We heard about territorial officials making threats against children." Blackwood's face was reddening. "You heard rumors and gossip. We heard truth," Thomas said calmly. "The kind of truth that travels to the tribal capital, to the federal Indian agent, to the newspapers in Washington that are always interested in stories about government corruption in the territories." Daniel watched the dynamic shift as Blackwood realized he was no longer dealing with an isolated family, but with an organized community prepared to fight back through legal and political channels. "Gentlemen, I think there's been a misunderstanding," Blackwood said, his tone becoming conciliatory. "The territorial government has no desire for conflict with the Choctaw Nation. Perhaps we can arrange a meeting with tribal leaders to discuss this development project more formally." "Perhaps you can," Joseph agreed. "After you and your men leave this ranch immediately." Marcus stepped forward aggressively. "You can't order us around, old man." The other Choctaw riders moved their hands closer to their weapons. The tension on the porch became electric. "Actually, we can," Joseph said with quiet authority. "This is still tribal land until proven otherwise in federal court. You're trespassing without permission." Blackwood was trapped between his mission and the reality of armed resistance from organized tribal members. Violence would create exactly the kind of public relations disaster he'd been sent to avoid. "Very well," he said finally. "We'll withdraw for now. But Mr. Tushka, this matter is far from resolved. The territorial government has committed significant resources to this project. The Choctaw Nation has committed significant resources to protecting our people," Joseph replied firmly. As Blackwood and his men mounted their horses, the territorial representative turned back to Daniel with cold finality. "Mr. Tushka, you've bought yourself time, nothing more. We will return with proper legal authority and federal backing. When we do, your tribal friends won't be able to help you." Daniel watched the 6 riders disappear down the road, but he felt no relief. The threat had merely evolved, becoming more sophisticated and dangerous. Joseph approached the porch as the dust settled. "Daniel, you can't stay here alone. They'll be back with more men, or they'll try something indirect. House fire, poisoned livestock, an accident on the road." "I won't be driven from my daughter's birthright," Daniel said stubbornly. "And we won't let you face this alone," Thomas added. "The tribal council meets tomorrow. We'll discuss formal protection for Choctaw families facing this kind of pressure. In the meantime," Joseph said, "pack what you need for a few days. Bring the girls to my ranch. Safety in numbers while we figure out our legal options." Daniel looked back at his house, where Kinta and Marley were watching through the window. They'd heard everything, he realized. His brave, traumatized daughters were learning that the world held dangers far beyond cruel stepmothers. The sound of distant thunder rolled across the prairie, though the sky was clear. It would rain tonight, Daniel thought. The first rain since the chaining incident. He hoped it would wash away some of the blood that seemed to be soaking into the soil around his family. But he feared it would only feed the roots of something darker growing beneath their feet. 2 weeks after taking refuge at Joseph Battius' ranch, Daniel woke to the acrid smell of smoke drifting through the pre-dawn darkness. He rushed to the window and saw an orange glow on the eastern horizon. His ranch was burning, the house where his daughters had been born, where their mother had died, where 3 generations of his family had built their lives, was being consumed by flames that could be seen for miles across the Oklahoma prairie. Kinta and Marley appeared in the doorway of the guest room, their faces pale with understanding. They didn't need to be told what the distant fire meant. Their childhood home was being erased from the earth while they stood helpless to stop it. Joseph joined them at the window, his weathered face grim in the firelight. "Started about an hour ago," he said quietly. "By the time anyone could respond, it was too far gone to save. Professional job, multiple ignition points, accelerants, probably set to burn hottest when the wind was right." Daniel felt something die inside his chest as he watched decades of memories turn to ash. His grandmother's rocking chair, Ayana's wedding dress carefully preserved in cedar, the girls' baby clothes, family photographs, the hand-carved cradle that had held 4 generations of Tushka children, all of it gone. "Papa," Marley whispered, slipping her small hand into his. "I'm sorry about our house." Daniel pulled both daughters close, fighting back tears. "Houses can be rebuilt, little ones. What matters is that we're safe." But even as he spoke, the dying words, Daniel knew this was more than property destruction. This was psychological warfare designed to break his spirit, to convince him that resistance was futile. The message was clear. If they could burn his house while he was under tribal protection, nowhere was truly safe. A rider approached the ranch at full gallop, and Daniel recognized Thomas Yahola's distinctive paint horse. Thomas dismounted. While his horse was still moving, his face urgent with news. "Daniel, Joseph, we have a problem," Thomas said, breathing hard. "The fire isn't the only thing that happened tonight. Victoria Tushka is dead." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Despite everything she'd done, Victoria had been his wife, the woman he'd trusted with his daughters' lives. "What happened?" "Found her body in a hotel room in Tulsa," Thomas continued. "Official cause is laudanum overdose, but there's more. She left a confession letter claiming responsibility for the house fire, saying she couldn't live with the guilt of what she'd done." To the children, Joseph's expression darkened with understanding. "Convenient timing for that attack of conscience, right after the Territorial Commission. Needs a scapegoat." "It gets worse," Thomas said. "The confession also claims Daniel has been unstable since his wife's death, that he's been neglecting the children, that the house fire was started accidentally during one of his drinking binges." Daniel stared at Thomas in disbelief. Even in death, Victoria was being used to destroy his reputation and justify the land seizure. Thomas, you know I don't drink. Joseph, you've seen how I care for my daughters. We know, Joseph said firmly. But the territorial newspapers are already running the story. Tragic end to domestic violence case is the headline in this morning's Tulsa Herald. They're painting Victoria as a martyred stepmother who died of guilt over failing to protect innocent children from their disturbed father. The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope. Victoria's murder had been disguised as suicide, her confession forged to provide legal cover for the house burning and future custody challenges. Daniel realized he was dealing with people who would kill anyone who became inconvenient. There's more, Thomas said reluctantly. Federal marshals are on their way here with a warrant for your arrest on charges of arson and child endangerment. They'll also be taking Kinta and Marley into protective custody pending a formal investigation. Daniel felt the world tilting beneath his feet. They're taking my daughters temporarily, according to the warrant. But the designated guardian is Margaret Blackwood, Theodore Blackwood's sister. She runs a children's home in Oklahoma City that specializes in civilizing Indian children. The full scope of the conspiracy revealed itself like a nightmare coming into focus. They would arrest Daniel on fabricated charges, place his daughters in the custody of their allies, and use the resulting legal chaos to finalize the land seizure. By the time Daniel could prove his innocence, his daughters would be lost in the boarding school system, and his property would be developed. How long do we have? Daniel asked. Maybe an hour, Thomas replied. Joseph, the tribal council met in emergency session last night. We're prepared to resist federal overreach on tribal lands, but this puts us in direct conflict with federal authority. Joseph nodded grimly. Which is exactly what they want. Force us into an armed confrontation that will justify military intervention against the entire Choctaw community. Daniel looked at his daughters, who were listening to every word with the solemn intensity of children forced to understand adult dangers. They'd already lost their mother, their stepmother, and their home. Now they face separation from their father and cultural extinction in a government boarding school. Papa, Kinta said quietly, what if we just left, went somewhere far away where they couldn't find us? The innocent suggestion carried more wisdom than Daniel wanted to acknowledge. Flight might be their only option, but it would mean abandoning everything, living as fugitives, never having a permanent home again. Where would we go, little dove? These people have territorial authority, federal connections, unlimited resources. They could track us anywhere in the United States. What about beyond the United States? Mahali asked. Thomas and Joseph exchanged meaningful looks. Mexico, Thomas said slowly. There are Choctaw communities south of the Rio Grande, families who left during the removals and never came back. They live free there, outside American jurisdiction. That's 1,000 miles through hostile territory, Joseph pointed out. With winter coming, 2 young children, limited supplies, better than separation and cultural death, Daniel said firmly. If we stay, they win everything. If we run, at least we stay together. The sound of distant hoofbeats interrupted. They're planning. Multiple riders approaching fast from the east. The federal marshals were ahead of schedule. Decision time, Thomas said urgently. Joseph, you still have those horses you were saving for the tribal gather? Already saddled and provisioned, Joseph replied. I had a feeling this morning would bring choices. Daniel looked one last time toward the orange glow of his burning home, then at his daughters' trusting faces. Girls, we're leaving now. Take only what you can carry in your hands. Kinta. And Marley moved with the efficient calm of children who'd learned that safety meant being ready to run at any moment. They gathered their few remaining possessions, a photograph of their mother, a small carved horse Daniel had made for them, the traditional beadwork their grandmother had taught them to make. Joseph led them to the barn, where 3 horses waited with saddlebags packed for a long journey. Food, water, ammunition, warm clothing, and gold coins sewn into the saddle leather for emergencies. "This one's yours," Joseph said, handing Daniel the reins to a strong-looking buckskin. "Steady, sure-footed, good for long distances. The girls can share the mare until they're bigger." "Joseph, I can't take your horses." "You're not taking them, you're borrowing them," Joseph said firmly. "Someday, when this is over, you'll bring them back." The approaching hoofbeats were getting louder. Daniel could make out individual voices now, orders being shouted, the jingle of martial badges and federal authority. "South, through the creek bottom," Thomas said quickly. "Follow the water for 5 miles, then pick up the old cattle trail toward Red River. There's a trading post at Spanish Fork where you can get information about the crossing." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Daniel lifted his daughters onto the mare, then swung into his own saddle. 3 days ago, they'd been living peacefully under tribal protection. Now they were fugitives fleeing their own government. "Papa, are we criminals now?" Marley asked as they prepared to ride. "No, little wind," Daniel said gently. "We're free people choosing freedom over slavery. There's a difference." The first federal marshal appeared at the edge of Joseph's property, a hard-faced man in a blue uniform who raised his hand to signal the others. "U.S. Marshal Service," he called. "We have warrants for Daniel Tushka and protective custody orders for his minor children." Joseph stepped forward to meet them, his hands visible but his stance uncompromising. "Marshal, you're on tribal land without invitation. These warrants need to be reviewed by tribal authority before federal warrants supersede tribal authority," the marshal interrupted. "Where is Daniel Tushka?" "Gone," Joseph said simply. "Left before sunrise with his daughters. Didn't say where he was headed." The marshal's eyes swept the barn, the house, the surrounding fields. "We'll search the premises you'll respect." "A tribal sovereignty," Thomas said, stepping up beside Joseph. "Search warrant or get off our land." More marshals were arriving, a full dozen now, all armed and ready for resistance. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong word or sudden movement would trigger violence that could spread to the entire Choctaw community. Daniel urged his horse forward, staying in the shadows of the creek bottom. Behind him, his daughters rode in silence, understanding instinctively that their lives depended on remaining invisible. As they reached the deeper water, Daniel could hear the argument at Joseph's ranch escalating, voices rising, threats being made, the sound of weapons being checked. His friends were risking everything to buy him time to escape. "Will Uncle Joseph be all right?" Kinta whispered. Daniel didn't answer immediately. The truth was too frightening. Joseph and Thomas were facing federal agents who'd already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder to achieve their goals. By helping Daniel escape, they'd made themselves targets. "Your uncles are strong and smart," Daniel said finally. "They know how to protect themselves." But as they rode deeper into the creek bottom, following the water toward an uncertain future, Daniel carried the weight of knowing that his resistance had endangered not just his own family, but his entire community. The men pursuing them would not be satisfied with his escape. They would want revenge against everyone who'd helped him. Behind them, the orange glow of the burning ranch faded into the grey light of dawn. Ahead lay 1,000 miles of hostile territory, winter weather, and the slimmest hope of finding sanctuary in a foreign land. Daniel looked back once at the smoke rising from his ancestral home, then forward toward the endless prairie that would either lead them to freedom or become their grave. Either way, they would face it together as a family, carrying their heritage and their hope into an uncertain but chosen future. 6 months. After fleeing across the Rio Grande into Mexico, Daniel stood on a limestone bluff overlooking the valley, where his daughters played with children who spoke Spanish, Choctaw, and the mixed languages of border communities that existed beyond the reach of territorial governments and federal marshals. The morning sun painted the desert landscape in shades of gold and red, and for the first time since finding Kinta and Mahli chained in the Oklahoma heat, Daniel felt something approaching peace. The settlement of Esperanza sat in a natural bowl surrounded by protective hills, hidden from casual travelers but visible to those who knew where to look. 43 families called it home. Choctaw refugees from various removals, Mexican ranchers who valued independence over taxation, former slaves who'd found true freedom south of the border, and traders who moved goods between worlds without asking governments for permission. Each family had arrived carrying stories of persecution and loss, but here in this hidden valley they were writing new chapters of hope and determination. Daniel's own family had found sanctuary in a small adobe house built into the hillside, its thick walls keeping them cool during the blazing desert days and warm during the surprisingly cold desert nights. The house came with a small garden where Kinta and Mali had learned to grow vegetables they'd never seen in Oklahoma, tomatoes, peppers, beans that climbed wooden poles toward the endless blue sky. The work was different from ranch life, but it was honest work that fed their bodies and occupied their minds. "Papa, look what Senora Martinez taught us," Kinta called from the valley floor, where she and Mahli were demonstrating their newly learned pottery techniques to a group of fascinated children. Their small hands worked clay with surprising skill, shaping bowls and cups that would be fired in the community kiln and used by families throughout Esperanza. The trauma of the chaining incident still visited them in nightmares sometimes, but here in this sanctuary they were learning to be children again rather than survivors. Daniel watched his daughters with pride and gratitude that sometimes overwhelmed him. They'd grown taller during the journey south, stronger, more confident in ways that had nothing to do with physical size. Their Spanish was becoming fluent. Their traditional Choctaw skills were expanding through lessons with other tribal members, and they were developing the kind of multicultural adaptability that would serve them well in a rapidly changing world. Most importantly, they were laughing again. Genuine, unself-conscious laughter that hadn't been heard since before Victoria entered their lives. The journey to Esperanza had taken 3 months of careful travel through hostile territory, following trails known only to smugglers and refugees. They'd crossed desert that could kill the unprepared, forded rivers swollen with spring runoff, and hidden from both American pursuers and Mexican bandits who preyed on travelers. Along the way, they'd been helped by a network of people who understood persecution firsthand. Station masters on the Underground Railroad, Comanche traders who moved freely across borders that existed only on government maps, and Mexican ranchers who remembered when Texas had been part of their homeland. Each person who'd helped them had asked for nothing except the promise that they would extend the same help to others in need. It was a debt Daniel intended to honor. A lesson he wanted his daughters to carry with them wherever their futures led. The world was full of people who would exploit vulnerability, but it was also full of people who would risk everything to protect strangers simply because it was right. A rider approached from the north, following the hidden trail that connected Esperanza to the outside world. Daniel recognized Miguel Santos, their most reliable contact for news from the United States. Miguel was a man who existed between worlds, officially a legitimate trader in leather goods and silver jewelry, unofficially a conduit for information, money, and occasionally people who needed to cross borders without government attention. His visits usually brought information about family members left behind, market prices for goods they could trade, and occasionally word from the federal government about wanted fugitives. "Daniel," Miguel called as he dismounted near the community. "Well, I have news from Oklahoma. Some good, some concerning, some that will change everything you thought you knew about your situation." Daniel made his way down the bluff, his heart racing with the familiar mixture of anticipation and dread that came with news from home. These updates were lifelines to the world they'd left behind, but they were also reminders of everything they'd lost and might never recover. Miguel accepted a cup of water from Maria Santos, the settlement's unofficial mayor and Miguel's sister. She was a woman who'd fled an abusive husband in Chihuahua 20 years earlier and had built Esperanza from nothing but determination and the belief that people deserved better than the violence governments offered them. The good news first, Miguel said after draining the cup in long, grateful swallows. Your friends Joseph Battiest and Thomas Yahola are not only safe, they're heroes. The tribal council successfully challenged the federal warrants in court, claiming jurisdictional overreach on sovereign tribal land. The case went all the way to the Territorial Supreme Court, and the ruling established new precedents for tribal sovereignty rights. The marshals were ordered to withdraw without making arrests, and several federal officials were reprimanded for exceeding their authority. Relief flooded through Daniel's chest like water through drought-cracked earth. Throughout their exile, his greatest fear had been that his friends would pay the price for helping his family escape. Joseph and Thomas had risked everything to give them time to reach safety, and Daniel had carried the weight of that debt through every mile of their journey south. But that's not the most important news, Miguel continued, his expression shifting to something between amusement and amazement. Daniel, everything we thought we knew about your situation was wrong. Theodore Blackwood and the mining operation, it was all built on lies and fabricated evidence. Daniel stared at Miguel in confusion. What do you mean fabricated? I mean the geological surveys were completely falsified. There is no significant copper deposit on your ranch. There never was. The whole mining scheme was an elaborate fraud designed to steal your land for an entirely different purpose. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. No copper. Then why did they... Railroad speculation, Miguel explained, pulling out a newspaper from his saddlebag. The headline read, Territorial Mining Scandal Exposes Widespread Corruption. The proposed southern route to California runs directly through your ranch, Daniel. Blackwood and his associates weren't planning to mine copper. They were planning to sell railroad right-of-way to the Santa Fe Railway at enormous profit. The mining permits were just cover for a land grab that would have made them millionaires. Daniel felt the ground shifting beneath his understanding of everything that had happened to his family. They hadn't been persecuted for mineral wealth, but for transportation routes. The conspiracy had been even more cynical and calculating than he'd imagined. Victoria had been recruited not to help steal copper, but to help steal a strategic piece of the future American railroad network. What happened when the fraud was discovered? Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Miguel's expression darkened with satisfaction. Theodore Blackwood disappeared in the middle of the night with most of the investment money, over $200,000 that belonged to territorial officials, Eastern investors, and railroad company advance payments. Several territorial officials have been arrested for corruption, including the territorial governor's chief of staff and the head of the mining commission. The federal investigation is still ongoing, but they've already recovered evidence of similar schemes targeting Native American lands across 3 territories. The scope of the revelation was staggering. Daniel's family hadn't been the victim of an isolated crime, but part of a systematic campaign of fraud and theft targeting indigenous communities across the American West. Where does that leave our land? Daniel asked. In legal limbo, Miguel admitted. The territorial government claims it was acting in good faith based on falsified information, so they argue the condemnation orders should remain valid. But federal investigators disagree. They say the entire process was corrupted from the beginning, which means all actions taken under those permits are legally void. Daniel felt a spark of hope mixed with frustration. His ranch existed in bureaucratic purgatory, neither properly condemned nor legally returned to his ownership, trapped in a maze of competing jurisdictions and legal technicalities. Kinta and Mahli approached from the pottery area, their hands and clothes covered with clay, but their faces bright with the satisfaction of creative work. "Papa, is Miguel bringing news about our home?" Mahli asked in Spanish, which had become her preferred language for serious conversations. Miguel smiled at the girl's linguistic flexibility and cultural adaptation. "Your home is complicated, little ones, but there may be ways to resolve the complications that would allow you to return if you choose to." "What kind of ways?" Daniel asked suspiciously. His experience with government solutions had taught him to distrust any offer that sounded too good to be true. The Santa Fe Railway is still interested in the southern route, but they need clear title to the land before they can proceed with construction, Miguel explained. More importantly, they need to distance themselves from the Blackwood scandal. They're willing to pay fair market value, real fair market value, not the fraudulent assessments Blackwood used for legitimate purchases from legitimate owners. They want clean transactions with clear legal documentation. Daniel began to understand the opportunity that was emerging from the wreckage of the conspiracy. They want to buy the ranch from me directly, bypassing the territorial government. Entirely, exactly. Clean purchase, clear title, no government complications. The railroad gets their right of way. You get enough money to buy land anywhere you choose, here in Mexico, back in Oklahoma, anywhere in the United States. And the territorial officials get to pretend the whole mess never happened. The proposal was tempting beyond words. Enough money to buy property anywhere, to give his daughters security and educational opportunities, to start fresh without the weight of persecution and trauma hanging over their family like a permanent storm cloud. But it would also mean abandoning the land where his ancestors were buried, where his wife had died, giving birth to his children, where 4 generations of Tushka family history was written in the soil itself. The red Oklahoma earth held more than monetary value. It held the bones and dreams of everyone who had come before. "Papa," Kinta said quietly, reading his internal struggle with the intuitive understanding that children develop when they're forced to mature too quickly. "What do you want to do?" Daniel looked at his daughters, then at the thriving community of Esperanza, where families from dozens of backgrounds had created something beautiful from the raw materials of hope and determination. Then, at the northern horizon where Oklahoma lay, beyond the desert and the river, and all the miles of uncertainty between here and there. "I want you girls to have choices I never had," Daniel said slowly. "I want you to be free to decide your own futures without having those decisions made by other people's greed or hatred or fear. We're free here," Mahli pointed out with the practical wisdom she'd developed during their months of exile. "We have friends, we're learning things, people are kind to us. Senora Martinez says we can apprentice with the Pottery Guild, and Senor Herrera wants to teach us silversmithing." "This is true," Daniel agreed, touched by how completely his daughters had embraced their sanctuary community. "But someday, you might want to go to university, to travel, to live in the world beyond this valley. Having legal American citizenship and property ownership would give you those options." Miguel cleared his throat diplomatically. "There's another consideration that changes the legal situation significantly. The federal warrants against you have been quietly withdrawn as part of the corruption investigation cleanup. You're no longer officially wanted by any law enforcement. Agent C," Daniel felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. "They're sweeping everything under the carpet to avoid public scandal." "Government officials prefer when their mistakes disappear discreetly," Miguel confirmed with the cynical wisdom of someone who'd watched politics from the shadows for decades. Bad publicity interferes with future corruption opportunities, and this scandal has already generated more negative attention than anyone in Washington wants to deal with. The implications were staggering. So I could return to Oklahoma without facing arrest? In theory, yes, though I would strongly recommend extensive legal representation and very careful documentation of every step. Trust is a luxury you can't afford with these people. Daniel spent the next week walking the hills around Esperanza, thinking about choices and consequences while his daughters continued their daily routines of pottery lessons, Spanish practice, and helping with community chores. The settlement had welcomed his family without question or judgment, offering them sanctuary when the American government offered only persecution and death. Here his daughters were learning skills and languages that would serve them anywhere in the world, surrounded by adults who valued their heritage rather than trying to destroy it. But he also knew that Esperanza, for all its beauty and security and multicultural richness, was still fundamentally a refuge, a place for people, running from something rather than running toward something. His daughters deserved the chance to choose their own paths, rather than having those paths limited by their father's enemies and their family's traumatic history. The deciding moment came during a community celebration for the feast day of Santa Esperanza, the settlement's patron saint. Daniel watched Kinta and Marley dancing with children who came from a dozen different cultures, switching effortlessly between languages and customs, their faces glowing with joy and belonging. They were thriving here, but he could also see in their eyes the same questions that haunted his own thoughts. What would their mother have wanted? What did they owe to the ancestors buried in Oklahoma soil? What did they owe to the community that had saved their lives? What did they owe to their own future selves? On the morning after the celebration, Daniel gathered his daughters for a family meeting in the shade of the Ramada Miguel's family had built behind their house. "I want to hear what you think about our choices," he said, trying to keep his voice neutral and free of pressure. "We can stay in Esperanza, where we're safe and happy and part of something beautiful. We can use the railroad money to buy land somewhere else in Mexico and build our own ranch. Or we can return to Oklahoma and try to reclaim our birthright." The twins exchanged one of their wordless communications, a skill that had grown stronger during their shared trauma and recovery. Then Kinta spoke for both of them with the gravity of someone much older than her 12 years. "Papa, what would Mama have wanted for us?" Daniel closed his eyes, remembering Ayana's voice during their last conversation before the fever took her. Her fierce pride in their Choctaw heritage, her determination that their children should know their history and their land, her absolute refusal to let white society's prejudices define their family's worth or limit their daughters' possibilities. "Your Mama would have wanted you to be free to choose for yourselves," Daniel said finally, "but she also would have wanted you to understand what you were choosing between—" "Then we choose to go back," Marley said with quiet firmness. "Not because we have to, but because we want to. That land is ours by right, and we want to fight for it, even knowing it will be dangerous." Daniel asked, needing to be certain they understood the risks. "Even knowing there are people who still want to take it from us, who might try again with different schemes." "Especially knowing that," Kinta replied with a maturity that broke Daniel's heart even as it filled him with pride. "If we don't fight for it, who will? If we don't go back, they win forever. And we've learned something here that they don't know we know." "What's that?" "We've learned that we're stronger than they thought," Marley said. "We survived their worst, and we're still here. We're still us, and now we know there are people everywhere who will help families like ours when governments fail them." 3 months later, after careful negotiations and extensive legal preparation, Daniel stood once again on his family's land in Oklahoma. But everything had changed in ways both devastating and hopeful. The house was gone, reduced to a foundation of charred stone and twisted metal that spoke of the night their lives had been set ablaze. The barn had been hastily rebuilt by railroad crews, then abandoned when the mining project collapsed under the weight of scandal and investigation. Weeds grew where Ayana's carefully tended garden had flourished, but beneath the tangle of neglect, Daniel could see the stubborn shoots of perennial flowers struggling toward the light. The old cottonwood tree, where 3 generations of Tushka ancestors were buried, stood unchanged and eternal, its massive trunk scarred by the fire, but its roots reaching deep into soil that held the bones and dreams of his people. "It looks different," Mahli observed, standing beside him in the ruins of their former kitchen while holding a railroad company check for an amount that would have seemed impossible before their ordeal began. "It looks empty," Kinta added, kicking at a piece of charred timber, "but not dead, like it's been waiting for us to come back and wake it up again." Daniel knelt and picked up a handful of the red Oklahoma soil, feeling its familiar texture between his fingers, gritty and rich and alive with the promise of things that could grow if given proper care and attention. "This earth holds our family's history," he said. "Your great-grandmother's footsteps, your grandmother's tears, your mother's blood. That can't be burned or stolen or legislated away by anyone." The sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment of reverence. Daniel's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, a reflex that would probably never completely leave him, but the riders approaching were beloved and familiar figures. Joseph Battiest and Thomas Yahola led a group that included most of the tribal council members, several neighboring ranchers, and even Sheriff Morrison, who had been quietly reinstated after the corruption investigation cleared his name. "Daniel," Joseph called as they dismounted, with the careful ceremony that marked important moments in Choctaw tradition. "We brought something that belongs to you." Thomas approached, carrying a leather document case that looked official and expensive. "Legal title to your property, certified by the Territorial Court, the Federal Land Office, and the Tribal Council. Free and clear, no encumbrances, no government claims, no outstanding legal challenges. The railroad company's purchase offer is also in there. Enough money to rebuild everything twice over, plus compensation for your suffering and legal expenses." Daniel accepted the documents with hands that trembled slightly with emotion he hadn't expected to feel so strongly. After more than a year of exile and uncertainty, he was once again the legal owner of his family's ancestral land, not as a government concession, but as a recognition of rights that had never legitimately been taken away. "There's something else," Joseph said with the hint of a smile playing around his weathered features. "The territorial governor has personally apologized for what he calls the unfortunate misunderstanding regarding your case. He's also authorized a special fund for families who were wrongfully displaced during the corruption scandal. Blood. Money," Daniel said flatly, though without the bitter anger that would have filled those words a year earlier. "Useful money," Thomas corrected gently. "Money that can build schools that teach both English and Choctaw, improve roads that connect our communities instead of dividing them, support tribal enterprises that create jobs for our young people. Money that can make sure this kind of persecution doesn't happen to other families." Daniel looked at his daughters, who were exploring the ruins of their former home with the fascination of archaeologists discovering traces of an ancient civilization. They moved through the space with confidence and curiosity rather than fear, pointing out rooms they remembered and planning improvements for the new house they would build on this sacred ground. 2 years later, Daniel stood on the wide front porch of the new house he'd built on the exact spot where the old one had burned, constructed with railroad money, but designed according to principles his daughters had learned in Mexico. Thick adobe walls for insulation, a central courtyard for family gatherings, and a workshop where Kinta and Mahli could practice the pottery and silversmithing skills they'd acquired in Esperanza. The Santa Fe Railway ran through the northern edge of their property now, carrying passengers and freight between the growing cities of the American West, but the trains passed quietly and respectfully through land that remained fundamentally Tushka territory. The railroad executives had kept their promises about minimal disruption, perhaps because they understood that their future success depended on maintaining good relationships with the tribal communities whose cooperation they needed. Kinta and Mahli, now 14 years old, attended the new territorial school 3 days a week and learned traditional crafts from tribal elders the other 2 days, switching between worlds with the ease of young people who had learned that identity was something you carried within yourself rather than something imposed from outside. They spoke English, Spanish, and Choctaw interchangeably, switching languages as naturally as they switched between their various responsibilities and interests. The evening sky was painting itself in familiar shades of red and gold, and Daniel could hear his daughter's voices drifting across the pasture where they were helping with the evening chores. They were discussing plans for the summer. Kinta wanted to spend a month in Esperanza learning advanced pottery techniques, while Mahli was interested in visiting the Cherokee Nation to study their approach to maintaining traditional government structures within the American political system. A letter had arrived that morning from Miguel Santos, reporting that several families from Esperanza had decided to return to the United States now that the corruption investigations had created new legal protections for indigenous rights. The community that had sheltered the Tushka family during their darkest hour continued to grow and prosper, a testament to the power of people taking care of each other when governments failed to protect the vulnerable. "Papa," Mahli called, from the barn where she was brushing down their newest horses, animals purchased with railroad money but chosen for their suitability to the demands of ranch work rather than their monetary value. "Are you coming to help with the evening feeding?" "On my way," Daniel replied, taking one last look at the sunset that painted his reclaimed land in shades of gold and promise before heading toward the sound of his daughter's laughter and the comfortable routine of work that connected them to the earth and to each other. The red Oklahoma soil beneath his feet held the bones of his ancestors and the dreams of his descendants, and that was a legacy worth any price his family had been forced to pay to preserve it. 20 years after Daniel Tushka found his twin daughters chained in the blazing Oklahoma sun, he stood in the marble halls of the United States Capitol building, watching Kinta address a joint session of Congress about the Indigenous Rights Protection Act she had authored as the first Choctaw woman ever elected to the House of Representatives. Her voice carried the same quiet strength that had sustained her through childhood trauma, but now it commanded the attention of senators and congressmen who would determine the future of tribal sovereignty across America. "Mr. Speaker, distinguished members of Congress," Kinta said, her words echoing through the historic chamber where so many decisions about Native American lives had been made without Native American voices. "I stand before you today, not just as a representative of Oklahoma's 3rd District, but as living proof that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied." In the gallery above, Daniel sat beside Mahli, who had become Dr. Mahli Tushka Santos, director of the International Institute for Indigenous Education based in Mexico City. Her work coordinated educational programs across 3 countries, ensuring that Native children could learn their traditional languages and customs while also acquiring the skills needed for success in modern economies. The sisters had chosen different paths, but remained united in their commitment to protecting vulnerable families from the kind of systematic persecution they had survived. 23 years ago, Kinta continued, her gaze sweeping across the assembled lawmakers, My sister and I were chained to iron stakes in the sun by adults who believed our heritage made us less than human, our rights less than sacred. We were 8 years old. We survived because our father refused to accept that might makes right, because our tribal community refused to abandon us, and because people of conscience across racial and national boundaries chose to help rather than look away. Daniel felt tears threatening as he listened to his daughter transform their family's darkest moment into a foundation for protecting others. The little girl who had documented Victoria's cruelty in hidden notes had grown into a woman who documented governmental failures in congressional legislation. The journey from that August morning of chains and torture to this moment of political triumph had been neither straight nor simple. After rebuilding their ranch with railroad money, the Tushka family had dedicated themselves to ensuring that other native families would never face similar persecution alone. Daniel had used his settlement funds to establish a legal defense network for indigenous land rights, while the twins had channeled their experiences into educational and political activism. Kinta's path to Congress had begun with law school at the University of Oklahoma, where she specialized in federal Indian law and constitutional rights. Her thesis on the legal precedents established by their own court case had become required. Reading in Native American studies programs across the country, she had served as tribal attorney for the Choctaw Nation, then as a federal prosecutor specializing in civil rights violations, before running for Congress on a platform of protecting vulnerable communities from government overreach. Mahli's journey had taken her in a different direction, pursuing doctoral studies in education and anthropology at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. Her dissertation research had taken her back to Esperanza, the sanctuary community that had sheltered their family during exile, where she documented how multicultural communities successfully preserved traditional knowledge while adapting to modern challenges. Her work had led to partnerships between Mexican universities and American tribal colleges, creating educational exchanges that strengthened indigenous communities on both sides of the border. The bill before you today, Kinta continued from the House floor, addresses the systematic vulnerabilities that allowed our family's persecution to occur. It requires federal consultation with tribal governments before any land use decisions affecting traditional territories. It establishes legal penalties for officials who abuse their authority to target native families. It creates funding for legal defense networks that can respond quickly when indigenous rights are threatened. Daniel remembered the years of careful preparation that had led to this moment. After Kinta's election to Congress, she had spent months building coalitions with representatives from both parties, demonstrating that protecting Native American rights was not a partisan issue, but a matter of constitutional justice. She had traveled across the country, visiting reservations and urban Native communities, listening to stories of families who faced challenges similar to those the Tushkas had survived. The opposition had been fierce and well-funded. Mining, companies, railroad corporations, and development interests had spent millions lobbying against legislation that would limit their ability to acquire indigenous lands through political manipulation. They had funded studies claiming that increased tribal sovereignty would harm economic development, commissioned legal briefs arguing that federal Indian law was outdated, and even hired private investigators to dig up scandals from Kinta's past. But they had underestimated both Kinta's political skills and the power of her personal story. When opponents tried to attack her credibility, she simply invited them to examine the court records from her family's case. Documentation of forged geological surveys, fraudulent legal documents, and a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of territorial government. When they claimed her legislation would harm economic growth, she presented evidence of the billions of dollars in mineral wealth that had been stolen from native communities through similar schemes. The turning point had come during a particularly contentious committee hearing when a congressman from Texas had suggested that Kinta was being overly emotional about historical injustices that were no longer relevant to modern America. Instead of responding with anger, Kinta had quietly asked the committee clerk to distribute copies of photographs, images of herself and Marley chained to stakes in the Oklahoma sun, their faces swollen from heat and dehydration. "Congressman Patterson," she had said with devastating calm, "these photographs were taken 23 years ago, not 200 years ago. The federal officials who enabled this abuse of children received government pensions until the day they died. The mining company executives who orchestrated the conspiracy used their profits to fund political campaigns, including campaigns in your state. This is not ancient history, this is living memory, and it continues to shape federal policy toward indigenous communities today." The committee room had fallen silent as the photographs were passed from hand to hand. Several members had visibly struggled to maintain their composure when confronted with the stark reality of what systematic racism looked like when applied to children. The hearing had ended with a unanimous vote to advance the bill to the full House. Now, watching his daughter address the joint session of Congress, Daniel felt the weight of history shifting toward justice. The Indigenous Rights Protection Act had already passed the House by a significant margin and was expected to pass the Senate as well. President Harrison had indicated he would sign it into law as part of his administration's commitment to healing historical wounds through concrete policy changes. Some of my colleagues have asked whether this legislation goes too far in protecting tribal sovereignty, Kinta said, her voice gaining strength as she approached the conclusion of her address. "I would submit that it does not go far enough. For too long, federal policy toward Native Americans has been shaped by the assumption that our cultures, our governments, and our relationships to the land are obstacles to American progress rather than essential components of American identity." The gallery, Daniel noticed other members of their extended family who had come to witness this historic moment. Joseph Battiest's grandson sat 2 rows ahead. He had become a federal judge and had been instrumental in establishing the legal precedents that made Kinta's legislation possible. Thomas Yahola's daughter was there as well, now serving as the Choctaw Nation's ambassador to Mexico, continuing the international relationships that had begun when the Tushka family found sanctuary in Esperanza. Miguel Santos had made the journey from Mexico City, officially as Marley's colleague at the International Institute, but personally as a man who had watched 2 traumatized children grow into leaders who were changing the world. Maria Santos sat beside him, still the unofficial mayor of Esperanza, still providing sanctuary to families who needed time to heal and plan their futures beyond the reach of governments that had failed to protect them. The audience also included dozens of Native Americans from across the country who had been helped by the legal defense network Daniel had established with his settlement money. Families who had kept their lands when mining companies tried to steal them through fraudulent contracts. Children who had been reunited with their parents after illegal removals by state child welfare agencies. Tribal governments that had successfully asserted their sovereignty rights in federal court. Each success story represented years of careful legal work, community organizing, and political advocacy. The network had grown from Daniel's initial investment into a multi-million-dollar foundation supported by tribal governments, progressive philanthropists, and corporations seeking to repair historical injustices. It employed dozens of attorneys, investigators, and community organizers who worked across the country to identify and respond to threats against indigenous families. The America we are building together, Kinta continued, must be a nation where no child is punished for the language they speak at home, where no family loses their land to fraudulent legal schemes, where no community is sacrificed to corporate profits they will never share. The Indigenous Rights Protection Act is not about special privileges for Native Americans. It is about basic human dignity for all Americans. Daniel thought about the other changes their family's ordeal had catalyzed beyond the political realm. The scandals surrounding their case had led to a complete overhaul of how federal agencies handled land disputes involving tribal communities. New protocols required multiple levels of oversight before any condemnation proceedings could begin. Mandatory consultation with tribal attorneys and independent verification of all geological surveys and environmental assessments. The territorial officials who had enabled the conspiracy against the Tushka family had faced various consequences. Some had been prosecuted and imprisoned, others had been quietly forced into early retirement, still others had been transferred to positions where they could do less harm. Theodore Blackwood had never been captured, but his network of corrupt officials and fraudulent investors had been systematically dismantled through federal investigations that continued for years. Victoria's role in the conspiracy remained complex and troubling even 2 decades later. Federal investigators had concluded that she had been both perpetrator and victim, recruited by Blackwood's organization because of her desperate financial situation after her first husband's death, trained to infiltrate and manipulate vulnerable families, but ultimately murdered when she became a liability to the broader scheme. Her grave in Tulsa was unmarked and unvisited, a testament to the way exploitation destroys both the exploited and the exploiters. In closing, Kinta said, her voice carrying to every corner of the historic chamber, I want to thank the members of Congress who have supported this legislation despite political pressure from powerful interests. You have chosen to stand with vulnerable families rather than comfortable profits. You have chosen justice over expedience. You have chosen the America we aspire to be rather than the America we have sometimes been. The applause began before Kinta had fully finished speaking, rising from both sides of the aisle in a rare moment of bipartisan unity. Daniel stood with the rest of the gallery, his heart full of pride and gratitude and a kind of peace he had never expected to feel in this lifetime. After the session ended, Daniel made his way through the Capitol's corridors to meet his daughters in the members' lounge where Kinta was being congratulated by colleagues and journalists. Mahli reached him first, embracing him with the easy affection that had replaced the traumatized clinging of their childhood. Papa, did you ever imagine we would be here? Mahli asked in Spanish, which remained her preferred language for intimate conversations. I imagined you would survive, Daniel replied honestly. I imagined you would be strong. I never imagined you would change the world. Kinta approached, still wearing the navy blue suit she had chosen for her address. Professional and dignified, but incorporating traditional Choctaw beadwork that honored her heritage even in the halls of federal power. The vote is scheduled for next Tuesday, she said, exhaustion and exhilaration battling in her voice. Senator Martinez thinks we have enough support to pass it without amendments. Daniel looked at his daughters, 2 women in their 30s who had transformed childhood trauma into adult purpose, who had used their suffering as raw material for building a more just world. They were both mothers now, raising their own children with the security of knowing that legal protections existed to prevent the kind of persecution their family had endured. Your mother would be proud, Daniel said quietly, speaking the words he had carried in his heart for years but had never quite known how to voice. Kinta and Mahli exchanged the wordless communication that had sustained them through their darkest moments and their greatest triumphs. She would be proud of you too, Papa, Kinta said. "You taught us that fighting back was possible, that justice was worth pursuing even when it seemed impossible." A week later, Daniel stood once again on the front porch of the ranch house. He had rebuilt on the site of their burned childhood home, but now he was not alone. His extended family had gathered to celebrate the passage of the Indigenous Rights Protection Act. Children and grandchildren, old friends like Joseph and Thomas, colleagues from the Legal Defense Network, former neighbors from Esperanza who had made the long journey north for the occasion. The evening sky painted itself in familiar shades of red and gold, while 3 generations of Tushka descendants played in the pastures where Daniel had once taught Kinta and Matli to ride horses and identify animal tracks, and understand that the land belonged to them as much as they belonged to the land. Miguel Santos approached the porch, moving more slowly now, but still carrying himself with the dignity of a man who had spent his life helping others cross impossible borders towards safety and hope. "Daniel, my friend," Miguel said in the mixture of English and Spanish that had become their private language over the decades of correspondence and collaboration. "I have something for you that I have been carrying for many years." He handed Daniel a small wrapped package that felt familiar even before the paper was removed. Inside was the carved wooden horse that Kinta had found in the ashes of their burned home 20 years earlier. The toy Daniel had made when his daughters were toddlers, somehow preserved through fire and exile and all the years of rebuilding. "The girls gave this to Maria when they left Esperanza," Miguel explained. "They said it was too precious to risk losing again, but that someday, when they had built something permanent, they wanted it back. Maria said today is that day." Daniel turned the carved horse over in his hands, feeling the smooth wood that had somehow survived everything that had tried to destroy his family's history and connection to this place. The toy was small and simple, but it represented continuity across generations. The love of a father for his children, the persistence of hope through the darkest circumstances, the refusal to let trauma define the future. As the sun set over the Oklahoma prairie, Daniel watched his granddaughter, Kinta's 5-year-old daughter, playing with the wooden horse in the same yard where her mother and aunt had once been chained like animals by adults who thought their heritage made them less than human. The little girl spoke 3 languages fluently, learned traditional Choctaw stories from her great-uncles, attended a progressive school that celebrated cultural diversity, and lived in a world where federal law explicitly protected her right to grow up safely on ancestral land. The legal protections would not prevent all future injustices. Daniel understood that institutional change was always incomplete, that vigilance would always be required to protect the vulnerable from those who saw them as obstacles to profit or power. But his granddaughter would grow up in a world where such protections existed, where networks of advocates stood ready to respond to threats, where political leaders understood that attacking native families carried serious consequences. Standing on his front porch, as darkness settled over the land his ancestors had defended for centuries, Daniel Tushka felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that suffering has been transformed into something larger than itself, not erased or forgotten, but alchemized into wisdom and strength and protection for future generations. The wooden horse in his hands caught the last light of day, and Daniel could almost hear Ayana's voice on the evening wind, telling him that some battles are worth fighting not because victory is certain, but because the alternative is unacceptable. His daughters had won more than legal victories or political positions. They had won the future itself, ensuring that no other children would face the kind of systematic cruelty that had nearly destroyed their family, but had ultimately made them stronger than anyone could have imagined. And that, Daniel thought, as he prepared to rejoin his family for the evening celebration, was a legacy worth any price they had been forced to pay. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.